If you're just arriving for the Jewish Currents Futures Forum, you have come to the right place, and we will get started in just 1 or 2 minutes. Good evening, everyone. I'm David Myers, a member of the board of Jewish Currents and the convener of the Currents Futures Forum. Today is the third event in our series of conversations that began with the discussion of the future of religion and the law in the United States and moved to the future of American Judaism as seen through the lens of Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews. The idea animating this series is to bring the critical and provocative spirit of Jewish currents to conversations that address important issues of our day. But there's a related goal, which is to imagine what the future, and indeed a better future, might look like. This aspiration has deep roots in the radical Yiddishist tradition, in which the name Zukunft, future, adorned many different journals and organizations as a reflection of the desire or demand to bring dramatic change to the world. In this spirit, we turn our attention today to the university, which has meant many different things to different people at different points in time in this country. The university has often been regarded, and with good reason, as a privileged, pampered, and exclusionary institution, and indeed as complicit in the perpetuation of an unacceptable social, racial, and gendered status quo. But the university has also been seen and has been a generator of bold ideas, an agent of change, and a gateway of opportunity. To consider an instance of relevance to the Jewish currents world, for many young Jewish radicals, the City College of New York was a shaper of their intellectual, cultural, and political visions. Similarly, for African American students, HBCUs have served a vital role both as sites of refuge from the discrimination of predominantly white institutions and as incubators of leadership for the community and beyond. In the midst of a renewed cultural war in this country, as the new University of Austin takes rise with its anti-woke agenda, as the gap between rich and poor grows in our neoliberal age, and as the field of critical university studies continues to subject institutions of higher education to careful scrutiny, it seems fitting to address the university today and in the future. We have a great panel with us to address this topic. I'd like to introduce them all very briefly now. They are brilliant scholars. Some are institutionalists, some are disruptors, and some, perhaps all, are both. I don't plan to identify who is who here, but they all have lots to say about our topic. So first, Maud S. Mandel is the 18th president of Williams College and a professor of history there. She came to Williams from Brown University, where she taught modern Jewish history and served as dean of the college there. And I just want to note that Maud will have to leave just about the time we wrap up at 7:15. In any event, welcome to you, Maud.
Thank you.
Next, Devarian L. Baldwin is the Rather Distinguished Professor of American Studies and founding director of the Smart Cities Lab at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and most recently, the author of In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. Welcome to you, Devarian.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Eddie R. Cole is an associate professor of higher education and organization change at UCLA and the author of The Campus Color Line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. I should say that Eddie is also a close collaborator with me at the Luskin Center for History and Policy at UCLA. And welcome to you, Eddie.
Hey, thanks, David. Hello, everyone.
And finally, Dr. Caroline Luce is an historian and lecturer in the Labor Studies program at UCLA and the communications chair of UCAFT. Just yesterday, the UCAFT gained a significant achievement when it signed a tentative agreement for a 5-year contract for lecturers in the University of California system. Welcome and congratulations to you, Caroline.
Thanks so much, David. Honored to be here.
So, we had thought you'd be joining this conversation from a picket line since the plan was to conduct a strike yesterday and today, but the strike was canceled in the wake of the tentative agreement, and so maybe that's a good place to start, Caroline. What was at issue in the proposed action was the status of non-tenure track lecturers, who today constitute a large and growing percentage of college instructors. This is, in fact, one of the most dramatic changes that colleges and universities have undergone in recent decades. The rise of a faculty labor pool that does not have job security, living wages, or benefits. So, Caroline, how did this come about? What has it meant for the university? And what does the UC action and what followed the threat of a strike tell us about where the struggle is heading? So that's a bunch of questions for you to take on, but who better than you to do so?
I've done a bunch of interviews in the past couple of days, so I'm happy to speak about it. Yeah, I limited my comments here to UC, but this is, of course, representative of national trends. And really, to put it simply, it's austerity. The UC expanded dramatically during the years leading up to and during World War II to satisfy the demand for engineers at the massive war production facilities that popped up all over the state of California, and expanded further in the wake of World War II as the GI Bill, other forms of federal student aid, and education grants helped to dramatically expand access to public higher education, especially for women, BIPOC folks, and other underrepresented populations. In fact, UC President Michael Drake credits this moment with his access to education at the UC. The visionary UC President Clark Kerr then put through this incredibly visionary document called the California Master Plan in 1960 that attempted to link higher ed funding across the state, including at UC, but also the Cal States and the community college system. So California really led in terms of this investment. But of course, this was followed by the taxpayer revolts led by Howard Jarvis and his friends in the 1970s. And really starting in the late 1970s, state funding for higher education stopped expanding and with the pace of enrollment. Basically, I think the stat is that the per pupil spending on public higher education by the state was about $23,000 in the late 1970s. It dropped to $8,000. I will note that we spend about $50,000 a year per prisoner to incarcerate people. So that incredible disinvestment meant that the university had to figure out how to cover this budget gap. And they did so in two ways. The first we're most familiar with, which is tuition increases. So in 1965, a UC student paid about $2,000 a year. Today, they pay about $15,000 a year. And that's one primary way the UC has covered this budget gap. They also responded to these budgetary pressures by replacing tenured faculty whose contracts guarantee them good benefits, salaries, and pensions with part-time and or temporary teachers that they could reduce the cost of instruction. So what that means is that at UC today, about a third of credit courses at the university are taught by folks who are lecturers, sometimes as high as 60% at campuses like UC Merced. We have the same training and credentials and often more teaching experience than our tenured colleagues, but our lives are incredibly unstable. Folks have to reapply for their jobs every year. They don't know if they're going to teach quarter to quarter, semester to semester, year to year. 70% of us are part-time, meaning we don't have access to healthcare or paid family leave, although I'm happy to report we just changed that with this contract. And we are almost 3 times as likely to be female as our tenured colleagues. So about 57% of the lecture corps is female versus 37% of tenured faculty. I don't have as precise statistics when it comes to race and demographics, but I can tell you that my colleague Trevor Griffey has shown in his research that about 60% of underrepresented minorities who are college instructors teach part-time, and another 17% are full-time faculty members who are not eligible for tenure. So this is the situation. There are more and more women, BIPOC folks, underrepresented communities who are earning PhDs, and there are fewer and fewer good, stable tenure track jobs for them to have in the academy. And what we were just able to achieve in this contract, we have been fighting for 2.5 years for a new contract. We've been out of contract for more than 2 years. three basic pillars of our campaign remained from the beginning. The first is compensation, as is true of every labor negotiation. You want to raise. We needed compensation that kept pace with the incredibly high cost of living in California, where even full-time starting salary for a full-time lecturer at UC qualifies them as very low income or extremely low income in 6 of the 9 communities where our campuses are located. The second was workload. UC, up until this new contract, didn't consider a lot of the work we did outside the classroom part of our jobs. So mentoring our students, writing letters of recommendation, serving on campus committees, developing new curriculum, not to mention converting all our courses from an classroom instruction to an online format during the quarantine. None of that was considered part of our jobs. And the third was job stability. And I have to say, of any piece of this new TA that we were able to win, this job security protections that we were able to win are groundbreaking. I'm going to use that word. For the first time, if you've taught a course, you prove yourself to do a good job through an evaluation system, you would have the right to teach that course again before they could hire someone else to teach it. That's what I mean to say when we save people's jobs. There were several people that I knew who were worried they were going to get churned out of their departments who now have that protection. That is, so long as they prove themselves to be a capable and excellent teacher, they should be able to teach their class again. We also want access to multi-year contracts so that at the end of that first year, if you've proven yourself to do a good job, you might be offered a 2-year contract. At the end of that second year, you might be offered a 3-year contract. That creates a career pathway for lecturers where one never existed before. Another piece of this protection is actually at the end of a lecturer's career. We have folks who've taught at UCLA for 20, 25 years, and there was really nowhere for them to go on the other end of that process. So these job security proposals create a pathway to a senior lecturer position, which will enable my dear friend Carl Lazowski, who's been an organizer with UCAFT for 20 years. He might be able to retire thanks to this package we were just able to get. So, you know, it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. It took organizing through an unprecedented global pandemic. It took 2 strike authorization votes and a real deal strike threat. We actually had members yesterday, because this deal was reached at 4 o'clock in the morning. We had members show up who were all like, okay, when do the pickets start? And we were like, no, we won. So people were really fired up. And for me, the way we were able to build that community, to build that power, to see so many lecturers standing a little bit taller with their shoulders up, proud of what they've accomplished, was just, it was a beautiful day. So I'm glad to be meeting you from my couch and not from the picket line today.
It would have been dramatic had we caught you from there, but your couch looks a little more comfortable. So just 2 program notes before we move ahead. I want to remind everybody that they can ask questions in the Q&A function. So please do so as our conversation continues. And 2, in light of Caroline's remarks, program note to panelists, we're going to shake up the order just a little bit. I want to ask Maud her perspective in just a second about the phenomenon of that labor pool that Caroline just talked about, represents, and fights for. But first, I want to go back to Eddie, my good friend Eddie, who I know has something to say about Clark Kerr and the visionary master plan for higher education in the state of California. We're already going to inject a little bit of a revisionist perspective into that subject. So, Eddie.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. First, let me say, Caroline, congratulations. Certainly right there with you on campus, really system-wide, because it wasn't just UCLA, it was the entire UC system. Related to that, you made a comment about the master plan in Clark Kerr, who was the president of the University of California system in 1960 when the California Master Plan for Higher Education was implemented. And I always like to sort of raise his comment, because the fact that you mentioned this was a 2.5-year process worth of negotiating, right? You did say it. 2.5 years, right? For a university to make the decisions that ultimately unfolded at 4 a.m. recently. That's important, that just the length of time that it took for a decision to ultimately be made is an indictment on the University of California system, how large it is, but ultimately the bureaucracy that's an output of the master plan in the first place. And so the master plan is well celebrated throughout higher education history, but I'm always a bit more critical, especially of Clark Kerr and other university administrators during that time, because ultimately, as the state of California created a 3-system higher education, sort of the UC system, the California State University system, and the California Community College system. This unfolds after the master plan in a way that has a direct impact really on racial demographics among students enrolled within California colleges and universities. And so we've got to be considerate of that, because this master plan also had other ripple effects. Like I know Martha Biondi, one historian, has written about this, that you think about just the racial demographics at San Francisco State. I'm just going to pick on California State University at San Francisco. The Black student enrollment in 1960 was 12%. By 1968, the Black student enrollment at San Francisco State had dropped to 3%. And that's a direct result of the California Master Plan, and ultimately how it structured the higher education systems within the state, and how it started to funnel students of color to certain campuses, certain systems. And that's also something we got to be critical about when we think about the University of California system in this moment, and we reflect on that history, that so much of this bureaucracy is trickle down effect from 50, 60 years ago, and we're still grappling with the same issues today. So congratulations in this current moment, but ultimately in a lot of ways, we didn't have to be here if we were as critical of the system and created change many, many decades ago. And to be fair, faculty, activists in the street, students, communities have been raising these concerns for years. But here's another example of us to remember how the decisions made in the past, academic leaders such as Clark Kerr, continue to have those, various levels of impact on just higher education today as we know it.
Well, it would be tempting to stay here in California and focus exclusively on the University of California, but and that would be a good corrective, by the way. But I think we'll have to shift our focus back to other parts of the country. And I want to just ask Maud, before we jump into the beautiful scripted questions that we discussed, what does this phenomenon of contingent labor, of this large pool of non-tenure track faculty, look like to you from your perch as president of a prestigious small college?
Yeah, I appreciate the question and hearing the discussion so far. As you mentioned, the president of Williams College, which is such a different kind of institution in some ways from the state systems we're talking about. They have, with its own history and complications that we can talk about as the conversation goes forward. Some of which I think, when you're thinking about the history of higher education, has its own, in some ways, trail of tears to talk about, and things I'm sure we'll address. But on this particular issue, of course, the college has lecturers. The college has, I in fact didn't start at Williams, but started an institution. I worked at Brown for 4 years myself as a visiting assistant professor in a role like this. So I have an understanding of what this can be. But at both institutions, those were supported in a way that does not that similar to the conversations we're having here. So institutions with different kinds of resource levels have been able, I think, to support sometimes contingent workers better, not always. And I want to be clear about that. But some of the issues that have come up thus far are affected disproportionately due to the kinds of resources available to the institution. Some of that's changed over time, and it also depends on the institution, of course.
So let's stay with this theme of the resources that an institution such as yours has. It really goes to the heart of how we understand the function of our colleges and university in society. So as we noted at the outset, institutions of higher learning can and have been seen as bastions of liberal, progressive, even radical politics on one hand, and yet these institutions are also very much guardians of the established order, certainly possessors of great wealth and privilege, as indeed Williams College is. So from your perspective, how do you imagine these institutions and your own today as guardians of the old order, as catalysts of dynamic change, as both? And what is it like for you in trying to steer the ship? It's not quite as unsteerable as the University of California, but I'm sure it has its own very deep entrenched.
It has its challenges. I love the question, and maybe as a historian, you won't be surprised to hear me say both and. One of the things that has really struck me about these institutions is the way they are both radical and conservative at the same time. And I don't even necessarily mean, when I say what I mean by radical is that nurtures radical ideas. That is very clear. I think we can see a history of it's not the only place by any means in this country where radical ideas are nurtured, but one place radical ideas have been nurtured has been in institutions of higher learning. On the other hand, when I speak of the conservatism of the institutions, the immediate assumption may not actually be what you were just saying, which I also think is true, the ways in which the certain kinds of pathways have been supported over decades of certain kinds of people and wealth, et cetera. But actually also even in the world of ideas, right? If you think about the tenure system, even those radical ideas to be recognized in the kind of tenure system, sticking right now to the tenure system, you have to be published in certain kinds of journals, you have to be recognized by your peers and even your radical peers who then become the owners of who gets to move forward in the process and inevitably end up, I won't say taking the radicalism out, but creating a kind of structure where change is slow. And this is maybe going back to something, Eddie, that you were saying about sort of what's possible in a system where the structures of change are kind of built into a process that, for better or worse, and I think you can argue both actually, but for better or worse, makes change slow and therefore small c conservative, almost by definition. So I think it's both. I think my own, going to my own positionality in it, I'm actually sort of comfortable with that because I feel like it lets us test ideas and think about them deeply. That personally speaks very well to me in my own sort of the way I think about sort of good change. But I think it can be extremely frustrating for people who are fighting the good fight for immediate change that they need, in the moment, which they do. So those things clash. I think from wherever you sit, if you're just talking about kind of the personal on this, it's challenging. I often say my role is, people think of it as, I think, like a CEO of a company, but I say it's more like being the mayor of a complex municipality in terms of all the different constituents who have something at stake. And you're trying to get that whole kind of body to move forward in some way, which is, while it's often fighting with itself and at odds with itself. So it's challenging. It's stimulating and interesting, but it can be challenging.
So we at a large public university often talk of the essential nature of our public mission of reaching beyond campus walls to the community at large, and really imagining ourselves as constituents and servants of the broader world out there. As partners, as really servants of that broader world. So I'm wondering what it looks like from your perspective, and what you imagine Williams College to be. We can be accused, as we often are, of attending only to our own, of navel gazing, of sort of containing sort of our aspirations within the borders of our campus. Williams has a long, illustrious tradition of attending to its students well. What is the Williams sense of public mission, especially at this moment in the history of higher education in the United States?
Well, I think this is one of the interesting places where institutions like mine and institutions like yours have been increasingly converging over time in the way that the people who teach in them, for sure, and the people who lead them increasingly think of our roles. I do think that our reach is very different. Who we serve ends up being different. But I think in terms of the goals of those of us who work in these jobs, we're increasingly thinking about public mission in the way that you're talking about. And certainly, again, I talk not just about Williams, but many, many years at another institution where, decades of leadership has been increasingly thinking about the role of the institution in the communities in which they're based and having an impact there. Almost by definition, if we're talking about Williams, our impact is much smaller than, say, the system you work and teach in, and by definition, therefore, it's we completely, I think of ourselves as working for the public good, but the nature of sort of how many lives we touch is smaller, at least in terms of in just literal demographic impact. On the other hand, in terms of sort of placement of alumni and the ways in which the larger impact of the school has had an imprint on the country and in other ways, it's probably outsized. And in that sense, I think we can also think of it and hope to continue to think of it increasingly focused on these questions of public good. And if it's fine, I know you're going to ask this later, so I'm just going to hint at this, but when I think about the universities of the future, one of the things I think about is if we can maybe turn back a little bit more, in fact, to these public commitments.
Okay. Well, I want to bring this forward now and turn our attention to Devarian and his really important book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, which describes in meticulous detail how institutions of higher education have, as his subtitle suggests, plundered American cities. So we've been talking about sort of the public-mindedness of institutions. Devarian, can you tell us what you meant by that subtitle, and whether you think sort of this image of institutions of higher learning as sort of liberal bastions is but a mere myth?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to hit listeners with just a real hard fact to help set the conversation. Colleges and universities are the biggest employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and even policing agents in major cities and college towns all across the country. Now, to be sure, this can have a positive effect. These institutions can bring ideas and people together and generate new ideas. But at the same time, in this, we have seen higher education's growing control over the economic development and urban governance of cities, or what I call the rise of universities. And this comes out of some of the conversation that we've been talking about earlier, whereby in a critical moment in the 80s and 90s, we see a declining contribution of the state to both public and private institutions. And we should all know that whether you're public or private, you get state dough. So that's number one. And so as that's declined, we have found in our notions of public higher education, whether it's public or private, has encouraged higher education to be more entrepreneurial, to figure out ways to generate amenities and to suppress wages and to understand their surrounding neighborhoods as real estate portfolios in ways to shore up losses in the operating budgets. And even with ballooning $30 and $40 billion endowments, we have institutions claiming austerity or restricted monies. But we know, quiet as kept, that very significant portions of those endowments are not restricted, or that restrictions are predicated on the capital campaigns by what you ask for. So if you ask for money for community development or public good purposes, it will be restricted towards that. But endowment and capital campaigns don't ask for that kind of restriction. So restriction is contingent on what's being asked for. So within this framework of the university, there is a cost to those living in the shadows of these ivory towers, those who are seen as ripe markets for wealth extraction, meaning the workers, the students, and the surrounding communities. So as campuses expand in neighborhoods, they also raise housing costs and displace residents in neighborhoods, largely of color or working class neighborhoods. Campus police force surveil and profile the same residents and are rarely held to public account. And higher education's broad control over labor can lower wage ceilings and suppress collective bargaining efforts for entire cities and towns. And so even in a small college town like Amherst or Williamstown, I've talked to the Democratic Socialist, the DSA chapter at Williams actually just earlier this year. And they were saying, well, we get what you're saying, but there aren't communities of color that surround us. What can we do? And I asked them a simple question. I said, well, what is the demographic of those who work in your food service staff? Those who work on the groundskeepers, those who work in support staff. And like any other city or town, that demographic is primarily working class, women of color, women and of color. Is there workforce housing near the campus whereby we can actually shrink the ecological footprint and engage in justice and equity beyond simply diversifying faculty, diversifying curriculum, but real DEI, whereby you can live where you work in equitable and eco-friendly ways, So every kind of institution in our country has a role to play in making these universities more equitable and just because of the ways in which higher education pervades so many aspects of our lives that have nothing to do with classes. We are still enamored with the myth of the schoolhouse when higher education does so much more beyond teaching classes and conducting laboratory work. And so we need to get into that frame before we can even have a real honest conversation about precisely what it is that higher education does and what good it serves our society.
Oh, I have many questions to follow up. So, with your permission, maybe we'll stay here for just a little bit. It seems that we're at this curious moment, both in terms of the discourse and in terms of the larger economic realities. On one hand, institutions across the country, privates and publics alike, are both speaking the language of the public mindedness of their sense of mission, as Maud gave testament to herself. At the same time, we see this ongoing process of the privatization of the university, right? As manifest in what you referred to, the entrepreneurial spirit, the language of the entrepreneurial, right? Where basically it means, efficiency is the modus operandi, and that often means austerity and constriction of budgets and sort of centralization. And all things that look good on paper, but actually, often don't work and come at a cost to people. So we have the public mindedness and privatization. We have sort of the language of universities as engines of economic change, as dynamic economic benefits and assets to a community. And then what you talked about is kind of universities as agents of economic extraction. So where are we at this moment in light of these two sets of trend lines that seem to clash with each other, the public and the private spirit of our institutions, the benefit and the extraction?
Yeah.
It seems to sort of capture the dual nature of universities. I'm just curious how you make sense of it, given your historical perspective.
Yes, I would say that number one, there especially in critical university studies, there's this powerful narrative of the rise of the great public university in the 1950s and its neoliberalization in the decades to follow, this kind of decline and fall narrative that historians know well. But it's quite misleading when we look at the history of higher education. We can go back to the country's founding and our great colleague Craig Wilder showing the degree to which higher education was intimately in bed with slavery and slave economies. We can move forward to the 1920s and talk about the role of higher education in reinforcing restrictive covenants and Jim Crow policies in the US South. We can move forward to the 1950s and talk about how higher education became the friendly face of urban renewal and displacing communities all throughout the country to make way for research parks and innovation centers that have become on full line in the current moment. And so what you talk about as a duality between the private function and the private investment, it's no longer a duality. They've converged. And they've converged in what I call the public good paradox, whereby the very claims of higher education's public good has become a financial mechanism as identified by their 501c3 status as non-profit institutions, which comes tax-exempt property status, that becomes the precise mechanism by which institutions of higher education can extract public resources for private for-profit interests. And I'll give you a real quick example. I want to also applaud the new contract. And I want to add another victory in New Haven, Connecticut, where I've worked with my Smart Cities Lab. I've worked with New Haven Rising, which is a collection of labor organizers, community activists, and students and affiliated faculty who have been together for over 20 plus years trying to better situate Yale within its urban, political, economic environments. And what they realized most clearly with the work that I was doing was the degree to which Yale's tax-exempt status, property tax-exempt status, aligns perfectly with its physical footprint as the biggest landholder and employer in the city of New Haven. That these things come together, so thereby the partnerships that go on this campus between the university and private investors in areas of the knowledge economy like pharmaceuticals, software design, military defense weaponry. In this new context, campuses and their laboratories and innovation districts, they become a tax and financial shelter for private investors who know this. And then the second layer is that they're able to extract additional wealth from graduate students because they get exploited under the status of being apprentices. And so you find all of these, the very nature of public good language, educational purposes on property taxes, apprentices in terms of graduate student labor. These are the very levers that become mechanisms for private wealth extraction. So we have to be clear about these arrangements and how they might have lofty ambitions, but their function in the current economy tell a very different story.
Okay, I want to just follow up with one more question, and then we'll move to Eddie, if I may. As we've seen this decline in state funding, and this goes very much to your point about private wealth investors, we've seen a stunning rise in what we might call the philanthropic industrial complex, the rise of philanthropy. And I'm just wondering how you understand university, college-based philanthropy, and particularly the instrumentality of the endowment, which becomes this repository of that wealth that you're talking about, which I would imagine you see as the result of the process of extraction. So thinking prescriptively, what might we do to sort of begin the work of what sounds to me like redistributive justice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I think endowments can potentially be an amazing thing. I think that even the tax-exempt status of higher education can be an amazing thing, but there is no regulatory oversight. So to take it to California real quickly, I'm working with some residents in the city of Berkeley right now. And there is they have some of the strongest rent control protections in the country. But there's a clause in the California state constitution that says if university property, no longer is that property covered by the protections of municipal government. It gets privatized. So those rent controls go out the door. And so this happened in Berkeley, whereby by the University of California, Berkeley buying this rent controlled building, they were able to kick out those residents and they're in the process of turning that property into high-end luxury housing for international students. And so this is one part of the story. But talking back to the endowments and things of this nature, if they're and the reason why I bring that story up about Berkeley is because the biggest complaint they had, residents, is that there is no regulatory oversight function that governs higher education activities like this. Who do we appeal to? The only thing they could appeal to was a lawsuit. That's all they could do. And so this takes me to another point about the regulation of these financial and philanthropic arrangements, that whereby if you have philanthropy, if you have property, university, private property, and we ask, well, to what degree is private development happening on this property for so-called educational purposes? The university will tell you, well, that's the job of the county assessor. That's unacceptable, right? There should be, if this is going to be offered, if this extraction is going to happen at the cost of, because that property tax money goes to things like public schools, snow removal, trash removal, the maintenance of bridges and roads. If that's going to be the arrangement, there must be some kind of overriding regulatory function that assesses the degree to which, what is the endowment doing? There should be some kind of arrangement that might say, okay, if you're going to have a 40, a 30, even a $500 million endowment, and you're sitting on this money with the argument that we need this money simply for the lifetime to maintain the lifetime of the institution, which is the argument we hear. And yet, you're going to get tuition every year. That's a specious argument. And so the counter response could be, well, you are required by law in order to maintain your tax exemption on your endowment to spend 5% of your endowment. What if we say schools that have a certain amount of endowment, you take an additional 3% of your endowment and spend it on community development projects? So for a school that has a $500 million or a $40 billion endowment, some schools' endowments during the pandemic rose by 40%. So if you had some kind of a protection or oversight in that way, or saying the degree to which you contribute to the community will be the degree to which we won't, or we will exempt you from your exemption. We will protect you from your exemptions. So to have these tax exemptions and these financial protections tied to conditions of the claims of public civility. So it no longer is just simply lip service, but it has some teeth tied to it. Those are the kind of things that I would be calling for. And those are things that I've been seeing called for throughout the country.
Great. Before we get to Eddie, I want to just double back to Maud and ask you, what do you think of that proposal? We have a concrete proposal on the table. You live in the world, you spend a lot of your time raising funds for your institution. I'm wondering
Sure.
what you think of that idea. And then I want to turn to
I do want to note that the large percentage of these endowments these days that are going to financial aid, which I understand is not I just don't want to leave that out of this conversation, because when we talk about the tax-free status and where some of this money is going, at my institution, a high percentage of the students are, so the proportion of students that pay full tuition is actually fair, relative to the full body, relatively small. Those paying it can afford to pay it, right? The full tuition. So the endowment does do work towards trying to provide access and opportunity for individuals who otherwise wouldn't be able to go to an institution like Williams. I'm part of Williams is part of the Goheen institutional network that is, promoting need blind admissions for all of our schools. But actually, most of us have become what we now call need seeking, which means we actually go look for talented students who can be successful on our campuses and to support them. And I think most importantly, I just want to flag things that are going on right now. And again, I come from a very, very specific subsector of higher ed, but you're talking about us in part. So I just want to note that, given the huge endowment payouts of this last year, which were remarkable and, historic, actually, most of us, certainly on my campus, but everywhere, are thinking primarily about the financial aid, both strategic sort of focus, absolutely, on core mission educational programs, but also on financial aid. So Williams just announced, for example, that we're doing away with the summer earnings requirement for all students on financial aid. So students no longer, for those of you who don't know, who are listening, about how financial aid is packaged at higher ed institutions, students for the history of financial aid have had to work over the summers to provide a certain portion of their package back to the school to cover the costs of tuition. And increasingly, as institutions of higher education have used summers as a time that we now think of the students as students. When I was in college, nobody focused too much time on what I was doing in the summer, but increasingly we do at places like Trinity. We're all thinking, internships and exploration of what's coming next, not just, in addition to the kind of engaged scholarship that goes with the life of the mind. As we move into those spaces, we think of those times as times where we want to support students from all socioeconomic backgrounds. And so we've moved into that space. Other schools are doing other things, removing loans from packages, from financial aids, et cetera. So I do want to note that. And I also just really important to note, I think, as we talk about things to be critical of, and I don't mean in any way to be defensive of higher ed, because there's plenty of things I think we can work on, just to point out the important research mission these schools do play in developing not just radicalism, as we talked about before, but scientific and public health initiatives, and so many important things that we need, that these endowments are being used for as well. So both and let's just make sure that we don't forget about that as we continue this conversation.
Right.
No, I totally agree. I was going to say this real quick. I totally agree with that. I totally agree with the point that you're making about the discoveries that are being made and the tuition and the reduction of tuition. But my point is that most of the conversations we have about higher education stay fixed on the campus and tuition. But the impact of higher education seems to go far beyond the campus and the educational purpose as employers, as landholders, et cetera. So that's important. Point number two, when it comes to discoveries that primarily come from federal grants, by the way, the research from that comes from federal grants. But on the other side, the discoveries that come from them are not then, they're placed on a private market and they are, and the value, the cost is not reduced to the degree that they are publicly subsidized and funded. My belief would be that if an institute is going to receive federal grant money on the front end for R&D, and then they're going to conduct discoveries on tax-exempt properties in their laboratories, then the end result of a discovery or a private product in the pharmaceutical industry should also come with a reduced rate for the public that actually made it possible. So it shouldn't just go back to the university in the form of a royalty to underwrite their endowment even further. So I would just add that as well. I agree, there is a both and. That we can do the discoveries, we can also take a piece of the profit that come from them and bring it back to reducing costs for pharmaceuticals for communities that surround campuses. We can not just offer tuition for the national market of students, but how about direct payments to communities and students that live directly in the community that surround? We have a whole history of gleaming, beautiful, elite NESCAC and Ivy League schools that don't bring students that live directly around their campuses to live and thrive on those campuses. That disparity can easily be resolved with some of this 40% land profit rush that just happened in the pandemic. I would love to see both that in that regard too. So thanks.
Yeah, especially as the language of the public mindedness of private institutions increases, as does the development, the endowment bottom line. It would seem putting those two together would entail redistribution of resources to the broader university or college community. That is to say, beyond just the student pool. I think that's the power of Davarian's proposal. I want to turn our attention now to Eddie, who has meditated and reflected and studied college administrators as exhaustively and brilliantly as anyone I know. So Maud, don't get too nervous. I
was going to say, this might be time for me to go to my next event. So go
right.
Easy, Eddie.
So Eddie, in your book, The Campus Color Line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom, you analyze the role that high-ranking administrators played in the struggle for racial justice, focusing on a 20-year period from 1948 to 1968. And we should say that the moral and historical balance sheet that you give us is a mixed one. What's your bottom line? How would you summarize the role of administrators in the struggle, and what do you think their responsibility is today? And I often think of our own institution as just an unsteerable ship. There are larger, vast, corporate, both in both senses of the word, interests at stake. So what is actually the capacity of university and college leadership to effect change and be real catalysts of meaningful progressive change?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I really enjoyed the dialogue that just unfolded with us. First thing, let me just say, as we think about higher education, again, I want to elevate the point of sort of the variation in institutional types as well, right? So to Davarian's point, who's very, very critical about making the connection between campus and community, not just campus benefiting campus, we got to think about sort of the unpopular or the institutions that we don't think about as often that are right there in the community. Community colleges in a lot of ways are essential to being there for workers, being in proximity to workers and in the community and so forth. So I think that's important as well, because that speaks to your question, David, about the influence of academic leaders. And so historically speaking, one word, I just say significant. And we can never understate post-World War II when federal officials and state level officials, when they couldn't figure out the broader race problem, right? As you think about Black soldiers going abroad, fighting the war in the name of democracy, then coming back to the United States, being treated like second-class citizens, when the pressure was on federal and state officials to figure out what to happen, what to do, they oftentimes look toward academic leaders. Like actual letters in the archives from President John F. Kennedy, as one example, writing to university officials saying, help us come up with, quote, special programs to address our racial and economic issues within the United States, right? So this level of influence, because ultimately, if we're going to say colleges and universities are places of discovery, right? If we're going to say these are institutions where the smart people work and the smart people live and think, then the people who lead those institutions also have a significant role in this sort of national conversation around what to do around racial justice. And so when you think historically speaking, Davarian just made a great point. And again, I want to elevate this as well. When we think about just the way cities look today, we can never overstate the significance of urban renewal programs. And for those of you unfamiliar, urban renewal is this sort of informal name of federal programs that ultimately gave millions of dollars to cities that ultimately went into sort of revitalization and really that displaced thousands of working class and community of colors, households, right, in cities across the United States. And so when you think about at the federal level, these are college presidents consulting with, at the time, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, that testifying before the U.S. Senate budgetary committees. These are federal elected officials taking cues from academic leaders, right? And this happens not only at the federal level, but it also happens at the state level, and it happens at the local level as well. So that level of significance and influence remains there. I mean, in so many ways. And when you think of sort of the broader responsibility of academic leaders today, it trickles down to when you think about faculty and staff, because when you think of agenda setting on campus, that oftentimes come from high-ranking academic administrators. So the true direction of an institution, what the values are oftentimes laid out. Think of this sort of the state of the university, the state of the college address. Like that plays a significant role in actually getting initiatives rolling. And then when you come down to even the responsibility to the public as well, right? Academic leaders have a responsibility to see the community not just as a partner within the educational enterprise, but to see the community as an equal partner within the educational enterprise. And that's so significant as well. And historical evidence shows that the most effective leaders toward bringing about transformative change and racial justice are those leaders that oftentimes, when you think about setting strategic plans, they did that with the community to figure out, can the goals of the college also meet the goals of the community? And instead of just setting out the goals of the college, oftentimes goes to the community first and says, what are your goals as a city, as longtime residents? What would you want from the university? What would you want from us as an institution? And when strategic plans are built around that ethos, that's the influence and the power for change and the legacy building of the leaders that we remember favorably for years to come.
And what in that regard has been a success story? Who has been an effective leader who has actually done what you've just described, Eddie, as sort of the model for an effective and truly community-minded institution?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of institutions. I mean, private, public as well. I'll give two examples, and they're drastically different. And I want to show these two very different examples because one appears at a place that we might suspect as much, but one appears at a place that we wouldn't suspect as much. And that shows the power of the individual leader. That's why I sort of have hope for the future, because our individual decisions make a difference moving forward. So one example that we might suspect a historical figure would be Martin Jenkins, who's the president of Morgan State University, where at the time Morgan State College, but now Morgan State University in Baltimore. That's a historically Black university. And I just want to be very clear about Martin Jenkins being the president there from 1948 to 1970, transforms that university, but also is deeply invested in Maryland as a state, not just Baltimore, but also consulting across the South and other states about how can we truly imagine equitable education for all people. He actually sits on a committee when the original plans for affirmative action were being developed, to where you actually had presidents of Black colleges and universities consulting with the presidents of the wealthiest white institutions in the United States at the same time for a brief period from roughly 63 through the early 1966, including a University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin. I mean, the wealthiest institutions that we think about today. That's another story about what affirmative action could have been, what it was originally proposed. But he's one example that gives us sort of a leader to think about. Another example, believe it or not, is Robert Goheen, who was the president of Princeton University from 1957 to 1972. And for this brief episode in 1963, Ross Barnett, who was the segregationist, white supremacist governor of Mississippi, actually is invited to give a speech at Princeton University in October 63. This is a couple of weeks after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, that took the lives of 4 young Black girls. And later that evening, 2 additional Black kids were killed in Birmingham. So you see this moment of peak racial violence within the United States. And you see a university like Princeton invite a segregationist governor to speak. becomes a free speech issue and a race issue at the same time. But there are also Black residents in Princeton. And that's key to remember. Like Princeton isn't just what we think of as sort of the Ivy League university. There's a Black Princeton that was significant then, significant now, honestly. And if you think about what that university had to do, what Robert Goheen had to do, after Ross Barnett came to speak, he actually went into the community and actually started meeting with Black residents in that community and came up with a number of initiatives, including rent control. That becomes a big issue because there's the cost of living in Princeton, New Jersey. This is 1963, not 2021. The cost of living in Princeton, New Jersey, the role of racist practices in hiring at Princeton University, and so many things. And he becomes an example of fundamentally changing, pushing a university as old as Princeton was at that time toward a completely different university that it had been up to that moment. Now, we can still be critical of Princeton today, but that's a transformative moment in that institution's history. And those are two examples, both a historically Black university and an Ivy League university, to where you see academic leaders come together and create change with the community.
Okay, thank you. I want to shift our attention as we move towards the last or perhaps penultimate question to a proposed remedy here, moving away from individuals and the role they have played to proposed remedies in addressing particularly racial injustice and deep structures of racism in American life and institutions. And I want to ask everybody for their thoughts on the proposed remedy of either EDI or DEI, equity, diversity, inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, depending on your particular institution, and how you would understand its rise and how you would assess its efficacy to date. Is this a good way to go? Is it the best way to go? And maybe we'll begin with Eddie, Devarian, Caroline, and then we'll end with Maud, so we're sure that we get you out just on time.
Well, I'll be very brief on the EDI or DEI comment because I know I just talked a bit. So I'll be very, very quickly. My assessment right now is we're sort of heavy on the diversity talk, right? We're sort of light on the actual racial justice part, right? So heavy on the talk, a little bit lighter on actual justice on campus. And I just want to sort of say that point because oftentimes we got beautiful frameworks, very thoughtful conversations around what to say, but we haven't quite seen the operational changes. And so we're talking about sort of the right language oftentimes, but we haven't seen sort of how the university functions differently. And that's what I want to see. If we're going to talk about EDI or DEI, whatever your framing is, we've got to see operational changes on campus because that's how to actually change a university. Because if you just sort of say what you want to do, but you're still doing the same things, you still got the same policies and practices in place, believe it or not, you likely get the same outcomes.
Thank you. Devarian.
Thank you. Yeah, so I first want to say, I'm on a campus that has historically not done well with recruiting and retaining faculty of color. And so we have a DEI or EDI project going on right now that I'm in the middle of advocating for. So I don't want to slight that we're diversifying the faculty, we're transforming the curriculum, we're renaming buildings from slaveholders to other figures in the community. We're doing all those things. Ooh, sorry. But if we look at DEI, again, simply or purely in the context of just simply curriculum and faculty diversification, and don't look at the E part, the equity part in a broader framework, we are doing that idea a disservice. And I want to put my historian hat on real quick to say that DEI is not new, that if we go back to the same time period that Eddie brought us to in the 1960s, and we look at what was going on in community colleges, in Chicago, in New York City, in Oakland, where you had in Chicago when Lane Junior College was renamed Malcolm X Community College. And the students created a framework of diversifying curriculum and diversifying faculty, but they also built a prison annex for incarcerated residents. And this is in '69, right? And they also fired off the off-duty police officers that were working from Chicago PD. And they hired a Black-owned, unarmed security team to offer public safety for their campus. So when we think about the things I was talking about earlier, it's kind of pie in the sky or radical, they're actually recoveries. Or we can go to Wesleyan. With the rise of Black studies at Wesleyan, Black studies at Wesleyan was not just about curriculum and faculty, right? That's right. I got you. I see you, Caroline. When Black studies came to Wesleyan, one of the first things they did and advocated for and succeeded in achieving in a predominantly white town, but not all white. There's definitely, because who cooked the food, who cleaned the floors. There was a Black staff community. They created affordable housing a block off campus. That doesn't exist today. That's a buried story that most people don't know about. This is a New England, NESCAC, small liberal arts college that created affordable housing as a part of their vision of Black studies. So when we talk about DEI and we constrain it to this very limited idea of curriculum and diversification of faculty, we do ourselves a gross disservice. That DEI has a much broader, comprehensive, transformative legacy that we need to recover.
Okay. By the way, you are always welcome to put your historian's hat on, especially in this group of 5 historians. Caroline.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to what Eddie and DeVarian have already said. But what we tend to talk about at UCAT is exactly what the two of them offered, which is the equity part. And I think, to me, part of that quest for more equity is actually to really radically alter our vision of the university. And I know this builds on what a lot of DeVarian have said, but people have this vision of students and faculty that is so exclusionary of, number one, the fact that students are workers. Number two, the fact that students are renters. Number three, the fact that students are community members. Number four, the fact that there are all these workers in between those students and faculty. Number four, the fact that I've lost my number count. I think that was more like 6. Number 6, the fact that there are faculty who are not tenured. I mean, it's really about all of us really ingesting what that means. And, at the UCL Labor Center that I'm proud to be an affiliate of, we have an Earners and Learners project where we realize that a lot of these students actually are working their way through college in ways that get completely lost in our conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It's not just racial diversity that the students represent. They represent a diversity of family situations. We have so many first-gen students in the UC system who bring a completely different package of obligations and responsibilities to being a student that get completely overlooked. And so we have these conversations about, improving all the, that would all be great. It's a white profession. Let's be honest. It's true of adjuncts as well. We are a blindingly white union. I love my union very much, but it's a problem. And I think the only way we might get to a solution is to really start, and I absolutely love what you said before, DeVarian, about these are universities. We have to think about the whole student, the whole person, and the whole composition and texture of campus, because it isn't just students and teachers in towers covered in ivory. It is renters, workers, community members in every capacity and in every function of this university. And I really do want to lift up what you said about the UC is the largest employer in the state of California. The largest employer in the largest state. It is the most powerful institution. And because of the way its charter is written, and I heard this from legislators doing outreach about our contract campaign, they're like, we have no oversight over the UC. I mean, they are effectively a fiefdom all of their own. And so some of the measures you were talking about, I would just add to DeVarian's list of measures that also their labor practices should be part of what we hold them accountable for. We talk about the gigification of higher ed. Higher ed was gigifying before that term was even floating around in the air. Uber didn't invent gigs, higher ed invented gigs, right? And so I think that, changing our vision of what the university is and how we hold it accountable is, right on, man. I don't have anything to add. Let's do it. I'm here. Let's go.
Okay. Maud, so we've heard a lot about the notion that DI or EDI is a great idea, but the operationalization of it has been less than ideal. I wonder what it looks like from your perspective.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think that where most of us who sit in these institutions now, what we're trying to do, and you see these in what are now called DEI plans across campuses, is to look not just at the areas we used to look at, which I think were focused in much the ways that DeVarian and Eddie initially started talking about, have been increasingly looked at what are we doing procurement? How are we hiring in for all, across the institution? How do we think about outreach in different ways? We've put a big emphasis, for example, for a little college, but we put a big emphasis on community college pathways and what non-traditional or sort of the return to college groups, so that we can think about outreach to folks who are looking to expand their educations in the ways we can offer, but from really different backgrounds. So I think there are a lot of ways you can operationally wind this in, from admissions to, really institutionally. I think, the language I've used about this a lot, and I really think I'm simply just echoing what's already been said here, is that if you really want to move the needle on these issues in our institutions, it has to be co-owned. It can't be, I think where we all did, and this was the right thing to do, was to create offices of diversity, equity, inclusion. That was the first right thing. The next right thing we did was to make sure that the people running those offices were actually in the cabinets of the president, right? Like sat at the table. The next right thing we did was to make sure our boards of trustees have diversity, equity, and inclusion foci or committees and people who are interested in that. All of that was really good, but the next thing I think has really been to say, okay, now what about everybody else? Are they co-owning this work, and how can we think about what it means to wind it through the institution? What I guess I want to say, though, and it perhaps just builds on the general tenor of this conversation, is, and that's just the next thing we're doing. We're not done. We're not, this. I think it would actually be naive to think that we are, from one hire or one set of practices or one set of shifts, we're going to, fundamentally restructure these organizations, precisely because we're talking about third rail issues in American society, major structural inequities. And so this is ongoing work. And I think my only concern when we talk about DEI is there's a sense of like, oh, yes, we're doing that. And it's, that means it's going to be done. And I think actually, Devarian, your point is these have long histories. We're the next chapter in those histories, and they will be ongoing.
So as we move towards the end, I want to just make reference to a question posed in the Q&A section, which is, what might democratic governance of universities look like? And maybe use that as a jumping off point to ask everybody, what single structural change would you like to see in higher education in the United States in the next period? Sort of really putting on our hats as futurists and thinking about the future of the university. And maybe Maud will put you on the spot, since you may have to exit before we wrap up. But just a very brief thought. What do you think is missing that really needs to be?
So you're probably not going to be surprised to hear, because of the position I hold and the way I think about these things, I so much don't think about one revolutionary move that we can make. I have a feeling my fellow panelists will answer the question differently than me. But I am heavily focused on the financial aid question, and to continue to think about the phrase we're using here now, and these end up being just phrases, but there's a lot of thinking behind this, is true affordability. So it's one thing to meet demonstrated need. It's another thing to think about how we make this experience actually affordable, so that students can take full advantage of the economic opportunities these learning opportunities that become unevenly available. So to go back to the equity question, because of socioeconomic background. So you'll hear, because I sit in the role I sit in, I'm focused on like, what can I do in the next 5 years with the resources I have available to me and the people I have advocating in order to make change. So that's how I come to answer the question, which is probably not surprising given what I do for a living. So I'll end there.
Okay, we're in the lightning round. So Caroline, Eddie, and then we'll conclude with Devarian. Caroline.
My pitch is just real true shared governance. I think you could develop any sort of parliamentary representative system of true democratic decision-making within universities, where all of the various constituencies that I was trying to lay out before would have some kind of representation. And sure, that could mean campus unions, but it might just mean various pools of workforce and students and actual, I could see that being a beast, but I'm glad that you described this as kind of a future question, because I encourage the same kind of thinking with my students. Is these are universities that we made. We can make them look the way we want them to. But I do want to say, if this is going to be my final comment, we have to organize. Like, y'all have to organize. And I mean you tenured folks too, because y'all are under attack just as much as we are. And if we want true academic freedom and shared governance for all, we have to work for it. We can't just write beautiful manifestos about how it should be. We have to get on the ground. We have to work with our colleagues. We have to organize. So that, I'll leave you with that. It's hard work. You can tell my voice is completely gone and I'm half fading in this conversation because I haven't really slept, but it's worth it. You can do it. If you work and you organize and you talk to people and you get out there, you can make this change. And so I'll put my emphasis there.
Thank you. Eddie.
Yeah, Maud, I'm not that far away from you because at cost, just the overall cost of higher education is out. Just I don't have the word for it right now, or nothing I want to say in this form. But what I will say is, if I could do one thing, change one thing right now, sort of with an eye toward the future, I think about that brief moment when the original affirmative action plans in higher education were being developed. That brief moment in history before the wealthier institutions sort of backed out and sort of stuck with the status quo. There's something to be said about a future where there more distribution of understanding across the broader higher education system. It's not just about the same institutions that we always talk about. There's a lot of heavy lifting being done across a variety of levels of higher education and a variety of institutional types. And if we could start to actually give some real props and real understanding with the backing of actual resources toward more institutions that'll give more access points to higher education for a wider range of people. And I think that's absolutely critical.
Great. And the last word, Devarian.
Yeah, I also want to go back to an earlier time period of 1985 when the radical urban planner Henry Louis Taylor, who was the father of Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, was hired at the University of Buffalo. And they asked him to put together a plan to recover the downtown campus after the main campus had moved to the suburb of Albany, New York. And he put together this idea long before Stephen Harvey and Fred Moten of the idea of the university as a commons. And what he meant by that was direct access, that the university would be an open palace, a real cathedral of learning, if you will, to the entire surrounding community, whereby there will be open access for classes, for lectures, for gym use. There would be landscaping that bled the campus directly into the campus, to the community that surrounded it. And conversely, there would be a different kind of investment on the part of residents into the campus at moments of fiscal crisis, a different kind of a mutual investment that will create a vision of sustainability. Well, when the administration heard that, they said, oh, we love the idea, but what we mean by campus commons is offering a discounted membership to the gym for residents. Landscaping is great. And ultimately what we mean is some housing for faculty, but not housing for the entire community and faculty mixed together. So to me, I hold that as a signpost, as a placeholder, if you will, about how we could have went a different path, and how we can still go that path. And at a moment right now where we still target the white family that can still afford to pay $70,000 a year, that's still in our mind the target audience for the marketplace. That's not going to sustain us. They're not having kids. And so if we begin to turn our attention to the Pell eligible students, that's going to require us to not just hire or bring in the individual student, but the families and the communities in which they come from, which means creating jobs, creating housing, creating support, social supports, in order to actually support those kinds of students. That's going to provoke a transformation about precisely what is the community's role in today's society, that will align how it actually works beyond teaching classes with how it purports to claim to be literally an ivory tower that floats above the world. There will be a new realignment. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Well, here amongst that panel of historians, that nexus between the past and the future is really most welcome. And I think we are now at the end of our time. I would like to thank our panelists, Devarian Baldwin, Eddie Cole, Maud Mandel, and Caroline Luce for a really rich conversation. And thank you all for joining this Jewish Currents Futures Forum. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.